It's Friday, January 26th, 2018. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Joining me today is Mr. Edward Lindsey, Jr., who is a current partner at Denton's law firm in the Public Policy and Regulation Division here in Atlanta, Georgia. He's also a member of Denton's Georgia State Government Affairs team, served 5 terms in the Georgia House of Representatives.
That's correct.
And 3 years as Majority Whip. Thank you very much, Mr. Lindsey, for joining us today.
Actually, 4 years as Majority Whip.
4 years as Majority Whip. So, just to begin with, I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about your childhood, your upbringing, and how you came to be Mr. Lindsey.
I was born and raised in Atlanta. My mother's family is from a tiny town in South Georgia called Pineview, which is located in Wilcox County. She is the daughter of a farmer and with deep roots down in that area of the state. To give you an idea of how small Pineview is, it's the 4th largest town in Wilcox County, but a great little farming community that I spent every summer at. But I was raised here in Atlanta, went to public school, first to E. Rivers Elementary School, and then to Northside High School, which saw a lot of transition during those years. I went from kindergarten through 12th grade. I like to sort of tell folks that my early life mirrored the civil rights movement. I started off in a segregated school system, which is what APS was in 1964, and graduated in a fully integrated high school in 1977.
So growing up, you know, your mother's from a rural community, small rural county. Growing up in Atlanta, were you aware of the tensions between sort of the city and the countryside?
Oh, very much so.
I mean, you spent time in both.
I have cousins with strong opinions on both, and family members on both strong opinions on both sides of that. I heard from around the dinner table. My grandfather was a state representative from down in Wilcox County, and then he was also a county commissioner. What I heard the tales of the county unit system, in which I believe 12,000 votes in Fulton County was worth 1 vote down in Wilcox.
It's pretty close to that.
My grandfather will argue that seemed perfectly fair to him.
I'm sure.
And for some reason, my relatives in Atlanta didn't. So I grew up understanding that tension, understand the politics around it. My earliest memories of politics were sitting in my granddaddy's pickup truck as he bounced along dirt roads looking for votes. And then I'd come back to Atlanta and see the changes that were going on in the city of Atlanta, and saw the contrast between the two.
So your immediate family here in Atlanta weren't active politically?
No, not that much. I mean, my father was a businessman, and so we weren't. But the issue of politics was always at the dinner table.
So you went up to college at Davidson.
That's correct.
Up in North Carolina. You majored in history, which is a great decision.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Well, I mean, total self-serving question, but how did your history education prepare you for, your legal career and your political career, if there's any connection?
Well, there's enormous connection. I mean, Harry Truman used to always like to say, "Those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it," and understanding where we came from, or where we have all mutually come from, tells us a lot about what direction we need to go in the future. History, not only from the lessons learned from history itself, but also the fact that a liberal arts degree teaches you how to write and teaches you how to articulate positions, which is extremely helpful in both the practice of law and in politics.
Were you interested or involved in politics while you were up in North Carolina on campus?
I was very interested. As a matter of fact, I was the president of the Young Democrats until my junior year at Davidson College. The 1980 election is really sort of the turning point for me from Democrat to Republican. That was the last year in which Jimmy Carter was the president. I was not terribly happy with his administration, did not feel like he had been a particularly good president, to be candid, even though he's a good Georgian. and it was his reelection campaign that led me to leave the Democratic Party and to vote for Republican for the first time, which was Ronald Reagan in 1980.
So that actually makes you, that's a very common story in the transition, from a Democratic South to a more competitive to a Republican South. What was it about Reagan that was it that you were just turned off by Jimmy Carter, or were you attracted by Ronald Reagan?
Well, a little of both,
Sure.
and history has been a little kinder to President Carter than the polls were at that time back in 1980. But President Carter, I think by and large, was a good and decent man, but he got so lost in the weeds that he facilitated a great deal, and it showed both in his relationships with Congress. Keep in mind that he had overwhelming Democratic majorities in both the House and the U.S. Senate, and yet had very difficult time getting most of his plans through. It showed in his foreign policy, particularly with the situation in Iran, and in his relationships with other foreign powers, who were often very frustrated with his leadership. And by contrast, Ronald Reagan offered a clear new vision of a strong America, a strong presence both in the world, and a hopeful vision. Jimmy Carter oftentimes talked about our difficulties and our problems.
You even kind of said it like Jimmy.
Yeah.
I noticed the affect there.
But Ronald Reagan offered us promise and hope, and his vision was very much that our best days are before us, and I believe in the politics of optimism, and so a lot of that is what attracted me to him.
Well, your best days were ahead of you after you left North Carolina and went to the University of Georgia for law school. What drew you back home to Georgia?
I knew I wanted to practice law, and I knew I wanted to practice law in Georgia. If you know you want to come home and practice law in your native state, there's no better place to go than the University of Georgia for someone who wants to practice law in our state.
So what was life like after law school? Sort of that early career period, breaking into the business.
I kind of decided to go try things. Like I said, while I grew up in the city, I had a lot of deep contacts in more rural areas. I was attracted to small towns, and I was also, and still am, an avid outdoors person. And so I first left law school absolutely committed to not going back to the city of Atlanta, but to go to a smaller town, and I went and practiced law for 3 years in a great town up in northeast Georgia, Toccoa, Georgia. Which was a wonderful place to start your legal career. I got to try everything that you could imagine, from criminal to commercial cases, and also, learned how to run a title and everything else in between. And it was a great way to be a young lawyer up in that area. After 3 years up there, though, I decided that it was time for me to come home. And so I left there and came back to the city of Atlanta. Short while after that, 3 friends of mine and I started my law firm that I had for 27 years, a firm called Goodman, McGuffey, Lindsey, and Johnson. We started off with 4 of us, and at the time that I left that firm to come to Denton's, where I practice law today, we had grown to a firm with about 80 employees in 4 states. So I got to see what it was like to build a business as well.
So you moved from a small firm, I guess, you were on your own when you were up in Stevens County?
No. I worked for a great little firm called McClure, Ramsey, and Dickerson that had been around forever up in that area. Very well-established lawyers.
Sure.
I got to learn from some folks that could give Atticus Finch a run for his money. One of them in particular is probably one of the best trial lawyers I've ever seen.
Just the prototypical country lawyer.
Oh yeah, he could charm a jury.
Mr. Lindsey's working with Matlock up
That's
in
exactly
Tacoma.
what I was. I mean, I learned more just carrying this man's briefcase a few times than any seminar that I ever attended.
So how you come back? This is 1987, 88 that you're in Atlanta.
87, 88, came back to Atlanta, started my own firm in 1990.
What describe to me, if you will, sort of the business climate, the political culture of the city of Atlanta, how it had changed since you grew up here to when you were establishing your career, leading into your political career?
Atlanta has been a forward-looking city. I grew up, in a city that had Ivan Allen when I was a young child, who was a very forward-looking mayor, the only Southern mayor to testify in favor of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as a matter of fact. Followed by Maynard Jackson, who led us further down the path of racial integration, and helped build the Atlanta airport to what it is today. And then followed by that by Andrew Young. Quite frankly, in the 90s, I think we lost our way a bit with Bill Campbell when he was mayor.
How do you mean?
I think that we became a much more divided city during that period of time. Even though we did have some good things that went on, we had the Olympics
Sure.
at that time. But I think to some degree, a lot of folks saw that as sort of a lost period of time. That was, however, regained during Shirley Franklin's administration and has continued with Mayor Reed's administration. I believe that political optimism is a bipartisan thing, and I like that the city leaders, both Republicans and Democrats, are optimistic here in the city.
Do you think that this is sort of a more theoretical question, but do you think that the presence of Atlanta and that political culture that you just described is what separates Georgia from other Deep South states like
Very much
Atlanta,
so.
South Carolina?
Very much so. I mean, if you look back into the 1960s, for instance, and you look at the city of Atlanta versus the city of Birmingham,
Right.
There's really, no reason why Atlanta exploded the way it did, and Birmingham got, to a certain degree, left behind, although it is also rebounding now.
Mm-hmm.
But a large part of that was that we were forward-looking, that we had people like Mayor Allen and business leaders like Woodruff and others who insisted on us, trying to figure out ways to work together. Mm-hmm. City Too Busy to Hate is a slogan, but it's also an aspiration. And a lot of time in politics and civic affairs, an aspiration is as important as a reality. Having a target out there to aim at. That phrase, sometimes people say, well, we're not really there. Well, probably aren't. But we are always striving to get there. That's something that we want to be. Mm-hmm. And that applies on the national level, the state and the local level. So, mm-hmm. And I think that's been a big way to differentiate us from other areas around the South.
And you're arguing that that's carried through now with
think
Governor
it has.
Deal.
I think it continues to do so through the Reed administration. There's some difficulties now, obviously, with the present federal investigation. Mm-hmm. Criminal investigation, mm-hmm. and we have to be wary of that. But overall, our city has weathered well over my lifetime. Right. And I'm very proud of my city. I was very proud when I was in the State House to represent part of the city and to help to advance that goal of being a city too busy to hate.
Now, how did you get involved in politics? Did you move back to Atlanta? I'm going to set up a law firm. I'm going to run. I'm going to run for the legislature.
When I came back to Atlanta, I got involved in other things. First, I got involved in my law practice. Then I settled down and got married. I had 3 boys. My wife and I have 3 sons that are only 17 months apart, our oldest, and then 17 months later came our twins. My primary focus as a young lawyer was taking care of my law firm and taking care of my family. Through them, I got involved in civic affairs. I was very busy and very much involved in my church, involved in youth activities involving my sons, involved in various civic activities in my area of the city of Atlanta. That was my primary focus. I came back to politics only, in the late 1990s. A friend of mine ran for judge in 1996, and she asked for me to be her campaign treasurer. It was Judge D. Downs, and that race, particularly after we won, sort of gave me another taste back for politics, and so I started looking a little bit harder at the political issues and the political side of interest. And in 2000, I decided to run for state senate. That didn't quite work out the way I'd planned. It was a tightly contested race with 4 other very good candidates in the race. We ran a very good race, particularly in my particular area, Buckhead. At that time, the state senate seat went from Buckhead through Sandy Springs up to Roswell, and I think in the end there were 5 folks in the race, and I came in third, just barely missing the runoff, but had built a good relationship with my friend Mayor Rusty Paul, who won that race. And then 4 years later, when this House seat opened up, actually was Rusty Paul was one of the people that talked me into running.
Walk me through the sort of the mechanics of running a campaign. This is Buckhead, so relatively Republican friendly. So were the primary is
Primary was
back then at least.
Back then, and now it still leans Republican.
Sure.
It's always kind of leaned Republican, but it hasn't been overwhelmingly so. So it is something that you've got to go out and sort of cast a wide net. You can't simply just go for one tiny segment or another. What I love about state house races here in Georgia, and particularly in more urban areas like Buckhead and Sandy Springs, is it's very much a residential sort of thing, and it involves retail politics. When I ran for the first time for the state house, I believe I knocked on around 5,000 doors. I'd leave my law firm around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I'd be able to start knocking doors at 4:30, and I'd knock on Monday through Friday from 4:30 to about 7:30. Then get up on a Saturday morning and knock on doors from 10 a.m. to 7:30. And then on Sunday after church would let out, knock on doors again from about 12:30 to about 6:30 or 7 o'clock at night. So it was a 7-day-a-week sort of thing. And in the end, I think that made the difference. I had, in 2004, 3 very good opponents, 3 very good people. And I think the big difference was I knocked on more doors than they did.
It sounds like running for state house is really good exercise.
It was. I lost 30 pounds. And I think maybe
I've never thought about that as an exercise.
It is.
Regimen.
It's a great way, particularly if you do it during the summer months.
Oh, sure.
And not only that, but 2 things. Number 1, people were astounded to see you at the door asking for their vote. Number 2, if you're a little bit sweaty, they feel a little bit sorry for you.
The pity vote.
So you get a lot of offers for water. And and also, quite frankly, you find out what people really care about. There is sort of a thought with polling, for instance, and I think it's a lot of truth to it. A lot of time, a voter will tell a pollster what he thinks the pollster wants to hear.
The Bradley effect.
But when you're standing there on their doorstep, they'll tell you exactly what they care about. And when I was standing on the doorstep, they were telling me, look, you got to do something about my property taxes, got to do something about my education, my children's education, you got to do something about the roads, transportation, and otherwise, stay out of my life. And that time and time again, that's what I was told. And and it's a great process. It really is. In terms of getting to know what what voters really think, and it's fun too, But on the same token, sometimes it's you get some amusing stories, and I'll tell you one that I really enjoyed.
Yeah.
I was knocking on doors, and I got my wife to come out one day to come knock on doors with me, and we went down one particular street in my district, and I said, well, you take the left side, I'll take the right side. And I went down the right side, and I started waiting for her, and she finally shows up, and I asked how she did. She said, well, I think I did okay. I said, well, that's okay, honey. I got 4 signs, people committed to 4 signs on this side of the road, we'll be fine. She said, you only got 4? I got 12. I said, how'd you get 12? I said, I kept telling people that my husband was making me knock on doors. They felt sorry for it. So, I learned a great lesson that day. But nevertheless, in terms of sort of talking to people and just sort of getting to know folks, it was a great way to do so. And I still get people, will tell me, yeah, you knocked on my door back then. So it was a good learning process.
Now, this was the 54th district?
54th district.
You've already sort of, ticked off the major issues, about that residential portion of Atlanta. But, when sometimes people think about, you represent Atlanta, you think, here downtown, midtown area. Tell me about the characteristics of the district that you
It was very much a neighborhood-oriented district. What I would tell my friends from more rural areas, while they represented a lot of times small cities, my neighborhoods were about the same size as their small cities. And so my neighborhood associations and my chairs of neighborhood associations, those were my mayors. And it was their concerns that I needed to work on. My theme when I ran for the House for the first time, and I kept it all the way through to the end, was protecting neighborhoods, taking care of those sort of bread and butter issues confronting folks. Like I said, roads, education, transit, very important in Metro Atlanta. Property taxes were of enormous concern then and enormous concern now in terms of the fairness of the process. Those were sort of the core issues that my community kept sending me back to the House to focus on.
So you were sworn in 2005. Mm-hmm. So you sort of, that was a real sweet spot for a Republican coming into the legislature.
And actually, I'll take you back to 2002
please.
Because, like I said, I ran for the Senate in 2000 and lost narrowly. But, remained very much involved with the Republican Party in Fulton County after that. In 2000, late 2001, early 2002, I got asked by Sonny Perdue, who was running for governor, to head up his Fulton County campaign. Worked very hard on his campaign in 2002, and was able to be part of that process, to see him get swept into power and be the first Republican governor since Reconstruction.
Can I ask you, were you campaign manager during the primary as well?
During the primary and the general election.
So tell me how you, as Governor Perdue's campaign manager in Fulton County, Governor Perdue, then Senator Perdue, State Senator Perdue, was from Perry, Georgia, down in Middle Georgia. How did you sell his candidacy, here in the city, here in the metro area, in a race against Bill Byrne, Cobb County guy, and then Linda Schrenko?
A lot just comes down to competency. The fact of the matter is Governor Perdue had been a businessman, someone who understood what it was like to not only sign the back of a paycheck, but to the front of a paycheck. He had he's a very down-to-earth sort of guy. The key thing for us was to get him in front of people. He can work a crowd better than anybody I've ever seen. He's just a very friendly guy, and getting him out in front of folks. He's very comfortable in that position, and he's very sort of, in many respects, he's exactly the sort of person that folks in my area like, which are sort of that business-oriented. We're going to do what government should do, and we're going to keep government out of what it shouldn't do. And those things that it should do, we're going to make doggone sure that it's done well. And that was the sort of the campaign that he ran in my area. and that's how we sold them in my area.
So from there, you take that experience and you're in the legislature. Tell me about the leadership that you worked with during those early years.
Well, we had, the first Speaker of the House was Glenn Richardson from Paulding County. And Glenn was, he some personal things that came up sort of later on in his career as Speaker, but in terms of his political savvy, he was extremely politically savvy. During my early years in the legislature, I got appointed very quickly to a group that was in charge of elections within my caucus. And Glenn could tell you what the vote history was in a precinct in Bainbridge. I mean, he had that kind of mind to him and that kind of political savvy. And he also understood issues very well, complicated issues. It's really kind of a tragedy, the difficulties that he had later on in his personal life, because he had so much going for him in terms of his intelligence. And he was one of the architects that led us to the victory. We went from a party with around 72 members in the General Assembly in 2003, 2004, and then we were swept in with like 98 members, I believe, in the 2004 election. So which astounded a lot of folks. A lot of people did not necessarily see that wave coming until it hit like a tsunami. And those were very heady days, in 2005, when we came into power and the transition. I mean, the joke was the Republicans were discovering rooms in the Capitol they didn't know existed because, we were suddenly coming into power. But you had Glenn Richardson, you had Jerry Keene, who was the majority leader, from St. Simon's. And you had others as well. We all coming into power. Mark Burkhalter was the Speaker Pro Tem. Mark was a good friend of mine, had supported me actually in the 2000 race, and then was very, very good to me in terms of helping me get the right committee assignments when I came in. He was the Speaker Pro Tem. So it was it was an interesting time. As folks who had been in the legislature for a number of years before, suddenly all taking the levers of power, and it allowed freshmen to get power fairly quickly. As a freshman, I was the vice chair of Judiciary. I was also one of the one of the four sponsors for the city of Sandy Springs, because part of my district also lay in Sandy Springs. And so we got a lot done from day one.
What were your top priorities? As that was the first time the Republicans had the state house in. Go back to Reconstruction.
Yeah.
Was there a policy program ready to go? Or was it
Well, yeah,
the dog that caught the tire?
No. We went in with a very strong program across the board, looking for education reform measures, looking, for instance, like the city of Sandy Springs, which had been an issue that had been tied up in committees forever. The people at Sandy Springs have been trying to get incorporated for about 30 years. Before that time, and like I said, representing part of Sandy Springs, that was a huge priority for me. Tort reform was another big issue that was of big concern at that time, and so we had to deal with that issue. So there was a lot of things that were on the plate. Obviously the issues that I was talking about, transportation, education, property taxes were issues of enormous concern. And those were issues that continued on, not just in my first term, second term, and third term. I was the only elected Republican inside the perimeter. So that gave me an interesting perspective and allowed me to get not only on the Judiciary Committee, was sort of my sweet spot as a lawyer, but also I was put on the Education Committee. and representing an area that included Atlanta Public Schools, which at that time was having some difficult times. Got me very much involved in the education reform movement. In 2007, I chaired the charter school study committee, which led to the first state commissioned charter school program in 2008. That unfortunately, in 2011, the Supreme Court rule was unconstitutional, so that we didn't have to come back in 2012 and change the Constitution. And I was part of all that. So, my position on the education committee allowed me to be part of that reform movement, trying to get Georgia education from where the promise was to more to the reality, which is extremely important. I believe education and quality education is the civil rights issue of the 21st century in terms of giving students in our state the opportunities that they should have, and trying to move us to a 21st century view of education. It has been a very difficult road, but nevertheless one that we need to continue on. That issue. Transportation has been another issue that I've been very much involved in over the years. Worked on that for, in terms of looking at it from a urban standpoint. I have my friends in the rural areas who understood the need for roads and new roads. What I would tell folks is that, representing an urban district like Atlanta and inner parts of Sandy Springs, we couldn't build new roads. But what we could do is improve the roads that we had and also expand transit. So I brought a perspective in terms of advancing transit to the Republican caucus and pushed very hard for that issue. Obviously taxes were very important, property taxes in particular. My first 3 terms were very important because far too often you had folks being assessed for a value that had no real correlation to reality. What I would tell folks is that folks were basically being taxed on an unrealized gain, and it didn't make sense. And so we worked with legislators.
Taxing hope is not
tax basically. So we worked on that issue, quite frankly, which led to a major piece of legislation coming down in 2009 that I was part of, that redrew how reassessments were being done and actually froze reassessments for 3 years during the depths of the recession, and I was part of that. We had, some other issues that I didn't necessarily see when I first came into office, but I grew to understand once I got there the importance of, and the biggest one of all was the issue of human trafficking. Was not an issue that I must admit, was as familiar with. Sure. As a lot of folks were, but I had some different church groups come to me in 2009 and 2010 and sort of say, look, Edward, this is a huge problem. It was a huge problem even around my church down in Midtown Atlanta. I go to a church called All Saints Episcopal, and it and North Avenue Presbyterian Church and a Methodist church down in that area have been dealing with that issue for years. They came to me sort of saying, we have this problem. We are not just a national, but we're an international hub for human trafficking. We want you to carry this bill. We can't get it out of committee. And I was going, look, I'm with you. I'll vote with you on the bill, but surely there's somebody better at this than I am. They said thank you, left, and came back the next time with my older sister. And my older sister made it very clear that sometimes little brothers should listen to older sisters, and she wanted it to be a priority. I went and sat down with them some more, went to some of these shelters where these kids were being trying to be protected from the abusers, saw the problem, and worked very hard with prosecutors, with police, with social workers, with religious groups, and we put together a coalition and a bill that hadn't been able to get out of committee for like 3 or 4 years, working with a friend of mine, Renee Utterman, in the Senate. We got out of the House and Senate with 1 dissenting vote. So, not only did I continue to work on those issues that my constituents told me were important when I first got elected, the House allowed me the opportunity to understand issues that I didn't even know existed, and to try to work on fixing those.
On that issue of and I want to dig into transportation a little bit more too, but on that issue of human trafficking, two questions. What was the legislative remedy that you and Senator Unterman came up with? And two, why on earth would it be stuck in committee with an issue?
Well, you had a lot of folks who were
salience.
basically, saying, well, it's a law enforcement issue. No, it's not a law. The cops are doing their job. It's a prosecutor's problem. They're not getting the convictions that they should.
Okay.
Well, you guys are focusing too much on the criminals in the situation. We got to focus more on the perpetrators. Or, well, no, we got to focus more on the victims and seeing what we could do for them. So everybody had their own agenda on how to fix it. And we took a look at it. And as the more I talked and the more other folks who were part of the coalition listened, we realized that each of these different groups had a point. And so we looked at it from a holistic standpoint. Mm-hmm. We first looked at the prosecutorial side and recognized that the law regarding what constituted human trafficking was vague, so we tightened up the definition. We then looked at the penalty side, and one of the appalling things that we came to understand is that the crime for drug trafficking was several times worse than the crime for human trafficking. Now, drug trafficking is a horrible crime and should be prosecuted in a tough manner, but so should human trafficking. So we tightened the penalties there. We then sort of sat down and said, what can we do to help the victims? One of the problems was the victims were oftentimes basically told, look, if you come forward, you're going to be charged with prostitution. And so, we basically said, okay, if you will cooperate with the police, that gives you immunity from the prosecution.
Right.
For human trafficking, for prostitution. So that helped both the victims and the prosecutors get the witnesses that they needed. We availed a victims fund that we have here in Georgia to help the victims get the necessary counseling, housing, and job skills that they would need. We enhanced the training program for police. To sort of help them be able to spot human trafficking taking place. We gave the GBI direct jurisdiction. It doesn't have direct jurisdiction over a lot of things, but it has direct jurisdiction over human trafficking to help bring their...
Is that because just it crosses so many jurisdictions that it's a...
Yeah. Okay. And so, it was a holistic approach. Wasn't the final answer, but it was an enormous step forward. Moved us to, according to most surveys, to being one of the leading states in the country when it comes to doing human trafficking, dealing with it. So, and skipping to transportation, a complex issue, but not sort of as sensitive as human trafficking. Transportation, and this skips ahead sort of in your career to after you leave the legislature, and you're on, I think it's the Joint Study Committee on Critical Transportation Infrastructure Funding, which is a mouthful, but a very important job. What was the work of the committee, and what were sort of the findings that well, you have to sort of go back to recognize the history that we'd had in terms of getting to that point in 2014 when that committee was put together. Okay. We'd been working on the issue in Georgia for a number of years. Governor Perdue very much felt that before we figured out ways to increase funding for transportation, we first needed to fix some of the governance problems dealing with the Department of Transportation. And that was his primary focus in 2008, 2009. And once we got a bill passed that helped clean up some of the from governance issues, we then advanced a bill in 2010 to create regional transit T-SPLOST in Georgia, and for it to go on the ballot in 2012. Unfortunately, while it did pass in 3 more rural areas of Georgia, it did not pass in Metro Atlanta, in 2012. So, quite frankly, we had to sort of step back and go, look, we still got a problem. Voters didn't like this solution, so we got to come up with a new one. And in 2014, as I was preparing to leave the General Assembly, Speaker Ralston asked for me to serve on this transportation study committee to come up with yet another plan. We ranked near the bottom of the country when it came to per capita spending on transportation. We were faced with the fact that we needed an extra $1 billion a year just to improve the existing infrastructure that we had. And so we had to sort of sit down and look at what other states did to move that forward. And fortunately, what came out of it was a bill in 2015 that provided for extra funding for transportation. The next fight that we have now is improving the transit system particularly within Metro Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And that's been a struggle for a number of years, and a fight that I've been a part of for a number of years to try to do so. The fact of the matter is, particularly in metro areas, economic development now is heavily dependent upon transit. Mm-hmm. Looking at what we see right now, for instance, with Amazon. Amazon's not looking, and other companies like Amazon.
Sure.
We shouldn't be just Amazon-centric here. But other companies like Amazon want to come to areas where their employees can get to and from their place of work in the manner in which their employees wish to get to and from work. And a lot of the millennials, transit is the way in which they wish to get to work. And so we need to take that more seriously. Right now, we still have within Metro Atlanta, I believe, I call it a Tower of Babel. We have MARTA focused right now in 3 counties. Mm-hmm. We have other counties that are running their own separate systems. They're not always talking to each other. They're not always integrated. We don't have the transit system, whether it be heavy rail or light rail or buses that operate the way they should. And so we need to be taking a serious look at that, and we are working our way toward that. Mm-hmm. Not as fast as I want it to be, but we are moving in the right direction. One thing I do sort of remind people of when it comes to transit is that, or transportation period, traffic is aggravating, and we need to figure out ways to get people to move from A to B. But it's a problem that a lot of cities would love to have. That a friend of mine, Rusty Paul, mm-hmm. who's like I said, mayor of Sandy Springs, likes to tell people, you may not like our traffic woes, but I got friends of mine who are mayors in the Midwest who would love to have our traffic woes. Because that at least shows some economic viability.
Sure. Thinking ahead, is economic development or the promise or hope of economic development enough to override the historic and political divisions that have separated, say, Cobb County and Gwinnett from MARTA, that sort of stopped?
Yeah, well, I think
is a centralized system?
Well, what you need to do
necessary.
Yeah, you need to look at a system similar to what takes place in Chicago, which mm-hmm. is they have an umbrella organization that handles the development ideas and the build out of new transit, but allows the various different operators underneath that umbrella to continue to operate. And I think that's probably the way in which we need to be going. From my talks with the House Transportation Chair and the Senate Transportation Chair, I think that's the direction that they believe is going to be best for us.
Thinking back to the 1980s and 1990s when sort of sprawl was the watchword, you can only, at least the conclusion was reached by many people, that you can only build so many lanes of road. But as long as there's development along the rights of way, traffic's never going to get any better. Is regulating development along rights of way, is that another? I mean, that's a very big government response or action.
I think that you need to be intelligent in terms of building out your transportation network. Mm-hmm. I'm not someone who believes that we ought to be telling people what they can and cannot do, or where they can and cannot live. But the fact of the matter is, you build a healthy transportation network, which includes a very healthy transit component to it. Mm-hmm. You can reshape where folks
Right.
will be live and work and play. We are seeing people just by the very nature of their lives recognize that, maybe I don't want to sit in traffic for an hour and a half or 2 hours a day going to and from work. Maybe I want to have my job somewhere closer to where I live and have my children's school. And keep in mind, when you talk about transportation, you're basically talking about quality of life.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
How many people would say, I really would prefer to sit in traffic than spend time with my children? And if they do, they got some
maybe there
issues.
are some of those.
Maybe there's
out there. I don't know.
But by and large, folks, given a choice, want to be able to do
Sure,
that. And
sure.
so we need to be building a transportation system that fits what people want and what people need. And that's sort of that's the difficult thing that folks have got to look at. In the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, maybe even into 1990s, that meant moving further and further out.
Yep.
Mayor Sam Massell, who's the head of the Buckhead Coalition, used to say, once time told me when he was mayor of Atlanta back in the late 60s, early 70s, he used to talk about it being a great plus that the city of Atlanta had no natural barriers to it, that the metro had no, we could go east, west, north, south. And he says, but when people got all the way out there, they started going, maybe we want to come back in. And you're seeing that. You're seeing that with a lot of millennials. They're seeing that with the city of Atlanta, which is experiencing population growth like it hasn't seen probably in 40 or 50 years.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Shifting gears away from transportation. Were you involved in the redistricting process?
I was, as the majority whip.
Right. So this would have been
2011.
Okay.
One of my key jobs was to basically present the majority argument on the floor of the House when the maps would come out for the House and the Senate and congressional maps. And it was a fascinating process. At that time, Georgia was still under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And the challenge that we had in 2011 was the fact that since the Voting Rights Act of 1965, no decennial map in Georgia had ever been successful without court challenge, without a successful court challenge or the Justice Department disapproving it.
Right.
70 maps, 71 maps, 81 maps, 91 maps, 2001 maps were all eventually thrown out by the courts and the Justice Department. So our challenge at that time was to basically clear a hurdle that Georgia had never cleared, and do it, when it was the first time that we've been in power and had the opportunity to do so as Republicans. And that was a very difficult process. We had lawyers on both sides who were looking at us. There was a lot of scrutiny that was going on, a lot of deep divisions by people who had various reasons for what they were advancing. And a lot of times it had nothing to do with party. Your closest political ally may be wanting to take a city or a neighborhood that you considered very important. And so it was a very, very interesting process that went on. We had, Speaker Ralston was very committed to an open process, and compared to other processes that have taken place in previous decades, I think we succeeded in that. Within my caucus, it was an interesting situation. As the whip, I was constantly having friends of mine come to me and go, well, I need to have this area because my mother-in-law lives in it or my Aunt Mabel lives in it. Actually, I had an interesting situation where we drew the lines, and the best way to redrew the lines was I regrettably lost my Sandy Springs part of my district and simply moved deeper into the city of Atlanta. And my house actually lays on the border between Atlanta and Sandy Springs. My house is in Atlanta. My backyard's in Sandy Springs. And so I had a great comeback to my friends who wanted this area or that area for personal reasons. I said, look, I gave up my dog. Okay, my dog is now wondering why on earth he's in another state house district than I am. So I said, so don't come whining to me about your aunt or your uncle or your favorite friend who isn't in your district anymore. I got to go home and explain to Dumbledore the dog why he's not in my district.
Good name. Good name.
And it was a good name. And I take great pride on a more serious level, as we went through the process. And, there was a lot of disagreements and a lot of hollering, a lot of partisan bickering.
Sure.
And I wish there had been more willingness on particularly on some of my friends on the Democratic side to work with us, but they chose not to do so. But I take great pride in this. I told you about the history in Georgia, about how every map prior to 2011 decennial redrawing had been rejected under the Voting Rights Act. Our map was approved by the Obama Justice Department. Talk about trying to bury a story, though. They pre-cleared us about 4 o'clock on Friday, December 23rd. But like I said, we were the first. Ours were the first maps that had ever been cleared by the Justice Department, and I take great pride in that fact.
How important do you think redistricting has been in sort of maintaining Republican or Democrats use redistricting for partisan control? Have Republicans tried to do likewise?
I think folks sometimes overstate the importance, and they like to play games a little bit too much, and you can see that on both sides of the political aisle. What I remind people is that we came into power in the state house not through a partisan map drawn by either party, but by maps drawn by a federal court. In 2004, they threw out the maps I was telling you about. And when the General Assembly was unable or refused to draw new maps, the court said, well, fine, we'll draw our own. And it was with those maps that the Republicans came into power in 2004. I have seen over the years the danger of a party trying to get too cute, and I'll use my party as an example. In 2001, several things happened when the Democrats were redrawing the maps. They didn't like this congressman down in South Georgia named Saxby Chambliss, and so they busted up his congressional district. They were mad at Sonny Perdue, who had switched parties. He had been part of the Democratic leadership in the Senate. He had switched over to the Republican Party, and they were going to teach him a lesson. So they busted up his district, thinking that they were going to be able to destroy these two guys' political futures. So what happens? Saxby Chambliss says, well, you're going to bust up my congressional district? Fine, I'm going to run for the U.S. Senate. And he beats Matt Cleland. Governor Perdue says, fine, you're going to bust up my Senate district? I'm going to run for governor. He beats Roy Barnes. So, you can be too cute. And I generally, what I tell folks, and it's a danger that my party, since it's in power, has to be careful about too. Don't get too cute in redistricting in terms of trying to settle political scores, because a lot of times it'll end up biting you in the rear end instead.
Speaking of party, how closely did you or other legislators, in the General Assembly, work with the state party leadership? Ellett Poitevin or other chairmen or chairwomen.
We worked closely with them on races. There was a lot of coordination. You go all the way back to Ralph Reed, who I worked with when I was on the Sonny Perdue campaign. Ralph was very good when it came to grassroots campaigning, and he did an excellent job with that. And I think that his work in terms of building the ground campaign had played an enormous difference in terms of the election of both Saxby Chambliss and Governor Perdue in 2002. When I was on the election committee for my caucus in 06, 08, 010, 12, 14, we worked to coordinate with the party, and we felt like we had good party interaction with them. The fact of the matter is, the parties can build networks of support, more so a lot of times to assist candidates. They can't elect a candidate; they can assist a candidate in getting elected.
Speaking of elections, you ran for Congress.
Yeah.
In 2014?
14.
How was that experience different from your experiences running for either state senate or state house?
It's kind of like going from simple math to calculus.
Okay. Okay.
A lot more complicated. The federal laws on elections are part of the reason they're a lot more complicated, and quite frankly, to a certain degree, needlessly so. While certainly you need openness and disclosure, a lot of the rules of the road when it comes to federal elections have more to do with regulators wanting to come up with their pet idea than they do to really showing the transparency. So there are a lot of things that go on. I used to joke, I'm a pretty good lawyer, but I had to have a lawyer when I ran for Congress. And I used to joke with them going, I now understand why people hate lawyers. But so you have that. Obviously the issues are different. The area is different. I was, running in an area with 600,000 people, as opposed to an area with around 54,000 people. I basically had held a seat inside the perimeter, fairly compact, and I was running for a congressional seat that went from Buckhead through West Cobb, Bartow, and Cherokee County. It was a great experience though for me. My sons in particular, they were out of high school, so I didn't feel like I was taking away time with them. But on the same token, they didn't have jobs of their own yet, and so they could come back and work on the campaign. So it was very much a family affair. One of my sons, Zach, actually took a semester off. I had intended for him to be what's called a body man, which basically travels with the candidate. But within a week, I realized that he was a lot smarter than simply being a body man. And by the end of the campaign, he was running my ground campaign and did a great job with that. It allowed me to see things from a perspective that perhaps I didn't appreciate before. And sometimes, and quite frankly, learn something about the anger of the populace that I don't think I necessarily saw in Buckhead, but once I got outside of the perimeter, I saw sort of a lot more the anger of voters.
What do you think?
And we'd gone through a tough recession. We had a Democratic administration that a lot of the Republican grassroots were very angry at.
Sure.
A lot of times folks go, were you surprised by what happened in 16 with President Trump? I'm going, well, not really, because I saw the same anger in 14. And quite frankly, I was an establishment Republican. And I accept that.
How do you define that?
Establishment Republican, I prefer the term governing Republican. I recognize that, that there were issues involved, but, at the end of the day, if we want to be elected, we have to govern. And this was not a year in which you sort of laid out the best way to govern. This was a year in which it was better to have pitchforks and torches. And I had a good opponent who was a good friend of mine I was running against. And, I sort of sit there and go, look, I know what we can do in U.S. Congress. We can do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 because we did A, B, C, D, E in the State House. And he'd get up and go, well, I appreciate everything Edward did, but, he wants to talk about laws he wants to pass. I'm going to Washington with a pitchfork and a torch. And the only bill I passed when I was in the legislature was a bill to repeal a law. The crowd would erupt, and I go, okay, I'm in deep trouble.
The 5-point plan was not.
It was not the year for it. What I tell people, sometimes go, well, do you regret losing? I said, no, the voters elected exactly the person they wanted.
Sure.
I raised enough money and I knocked on enough doors and we made enough phone calls so that the voters knew exactly who I was. And I wasn't who they wanted. They elected instead a guy that's very different from me, who's also a good friend of mine.
Sure.
Who had a very different vision than I did. And that's who the voters wanted.
What do you think, maybe you've already touched on this a little bit now previously, but what do you think accounts for the differing views, attitudes, levels of anger inside the perimeter in Buckhead, where you represented for several years, as opposed to, OTP out in Bartow County or someplace like that?
A lot of it is alienation. They don't feel like their party is listening to them. A lot of it is understandable fear and uncertainty. There is a palpable feeling of economic insecurity, even though we are living right now in pretty good economic times. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, you go to work for an employer, you no longer have this feeling, well, I'm going to be with this person for 5, 10, 20 lifetime.
Sure.
You don't know what the next turn in the road is going to offer. And that creates, a lot of unease and uncertainty. And it's up to the leadership and to folks who want to get elected to listen and to channel that in a positive way toward positive policies. That's the challenge of anyone who's elected now. You can't ignore that. Mm-hmm. You've got to listen to it.
Back in the 1980s, the two Georgias was the mm-hmm. big. There's Atlanta, and then there's rural Georgia. Do you think updating that a little bit? You've got the cities, the suburbs, and then rural areas. What are those policy prescriptions that can sort of, here in the city we're sort of insulated economically?
Well, you say we're insulated, but then again, here in the city we're also facing two Atlantas.
Yeah, sure.
Sure. The prosperity that you see in North Atlanta and East Atlanta.
That's very fair.
Is very different from a lot of the despair that you see
sure.
in other areas of the city, and you have to be cognizant of that and appreciate that. The worst thing that as a free society you can do is not show and demonstrate a pathway toward a better life for both that individual and that individual's children. And if folks feel trapped in their present circumstance and don't feel like there's a way out, that's danger for any society.
Sure.
And we have that very much still in existence here in Atlanta. I think we are trying to figure out ways to deal with that, but that needs to be a focus here, and it needs to be a focus in the state of Georgia, because we have the same situation now. We do have a very overall vibrant metro area, but we have areas of our state which are seeing economic decline, and they need help. They need sort of that basic infrastructure that will attract business into those areas. And the fact of the matter is, if you don't have a vibrant education system, if you don't have a workforce that's trained, if you don't have a medical system in place, if you don't have a road system that's necessary, and in this 21st century, infrastructure includes broadband.
Right.
Which is a extremely important issue. If you don't have those in place, you're simply not going to get the economic development that's going to be necessary to both give good jobs to people who are living there and to provide a future for their children. And so that is an enormous challenge to whoever's running for governor this year, and something that they need to be focused on.
This may be beside the point. That you mentioned education, workforce training, healthcare, transportation. The only one that isn't necessarily regulated is broadband, internet. Mm-hmm. Is it time for internet access, broadband, wireless access to be regulated like a government utility?
Well, actually,
as an essential utility.
To some degree, a lot of what we have to do is break down existing regulations to expand it in there. We have, for instance, I'll give you one example.
Sure.
Georgia Department of Transportation has a lot of very heavy restrictions on your ability to utilize the existing right-of-ways
Right.
to expand broadband. And they make it very cumbersome and very difficult to do so. And as GDOT goes, the county and cities often look at the GDOT's regulations and follow the same rules of the road for them.
Sure.
We already have right-of-ways available to us to build out broadband. Broadband doesn't require a lot of mechanics, a lot of hardware, but it does require access to right-of-ways in order to build out. So a lot of what we have to do right now is simply make these right-of-ways, which are already there. We already have, the spider web out there, but make it available to build out. Now, you do need some regulation to make sure that somebody who goes in and builds something maintains it properly and doesn't just abandon it, and you need to be worried about that sort of issue. I'm not taking away from those very legitimate concerns, but a lot of what we need right now is to basically clear out a lot of antiquated regulations that are getting in the way. Because here's what a lot of these private companies, and I've dealt with a lot of these companies recently, are telling me, and it's very true. It's that there's a certain finite amount of money that we have to build out networks. We're going to go right now to those states and those communities that make it the easiest for us to get our best bang for the buck. And if it's not Georgia, it'll be South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, or Utah, or someplace else. So the choice is really Georgia's. These companies are prepared to build out their networks, but are they going to build it here, or are they going to build it somewhere else? Are they going to build it just in Metro Atlanta? Or are they going to also build out and include Hayhira and other areas, or in my family's area down in Wilcox County? That's the challenge that we're facing now.
Yeah, zooming out a little bit, why were Georgia Democrats able to hold on to power so much longer than South Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee, Florida? Why were Georgia Republicans unable to?
Well, part of it
until
was,
the 90s
quite
and
frankly,
early
there were
2000s.
some pretty good governors, pretty good conservative Democrat governors. You had folks. And while I have some faults with Jimmy Carter when he was president, he was a pretty good governor and a forward-thinking governor. He was followed by George Busby, who was a damn fine governor, followed by Joe Frank Harris, who also made some advances, and followed by Zell Miller, who also made some advances. And Roy Barnes, I thought Roy Barnes was a pretty good governor on some levels. Disagreed with him very much on others. But on some issues, he was forward-thinking. So a lot of the ways in which Democrats held control was they had good candidates and they had good leadership. While we kept building and pecking away at it, because we had some pretty good people coming along as well. Folks like Paul Coverdale, folks like our President Senator Johnny Isakson, and others. We were still slowly building, but we were up against some pretty good leaders. And so I think that had a lot to do with it. The challenge for us now is to continue, now that we are in power, to always put forward similarly good leaders, because the pendulum swings. If Republicans are to continue being in power in Georgia, it's going to be heavily dependent upon their willingness to put forward those governing conservatives, and for the Republican Party to be viewed appropriately as the party of reform. The moment we become simply the party of the status quo, and we simply, try to maintain the status quo, that's when we will begin our decline, and the Democrats will be coming back.
How have the two parties changed since you got involved in politics? you sort of touched on how the Democratic Party has changed a little bit, but has the Republican Party evolved since you became active?
Yeah, it has. I mean, the rise of the Tea Party has had a very profound effect. Some good, some bad. You've got, you interesting enough in Georgia, you have both. You have the rise of the Tea Party, and you also have the rise of the governing conservative people who now have come up through the process of governing, and so understand the levers of power. So you have those two very competing different issues. And you see that often being played out, for instance, in Governor Deal's administration, which I think has been an extremely successful administration. I do think that he is going to be viewed by history in Georgia as one of the great governors. He's going to be viewed, I think, Zell Miller, for instance, on the Democratic side, probably in my lifetime was the greatest Georgia governor on the Democratic side. And at the present moment, I think Governor Deal will be viewed right up there with him. In terms of someone who had to govern through some extremely difficult times, who, despite having, just trying to basically keep the doors of government open, during
the bad old days.
During the bad old days of 10, 11, 12, he also advanced a lot of what I call conservative reforms. Remember what I talked about? We have to be the party of reform. Education, charter schools. Criminal justice reform, transportation, those issues that have existed, and so we see that sort of dichotomy right now within the Republican Party that's going on. The Democratic Party, I think, in all fairness, has shifted to the left in Georgia. They're viewed very much as they want urban progressives and different interest groups to be part of their coalition, which we can get into momentarily in terms of one of my concerns when it comes to simply looking at interest groups as block voters. But and so the Democratic Party, if they're going to have a pathway back into power, have to be that governing party, have to show a willingness to have that big tent. Republicans, if we want to stay in power, have to be able to do so. We can't simply rely on wedge issues. We have to rely on what I call gateway issues. Gateway issues are those issues that allow groups that may not be with you or may not have historically been with you to give you a second look.
Like criminal justice reform.
Criminal justice reform is a good example of that. Education reform. Nowhere will you find a greater differentiation between a party's leadership and its supposed base than on the charter school constitutional amendment in 2012, in which the Democratic leadership was steadfastly opposed to that constitutional amendment, and yet the base of its voters overwhelmingly supported it, because they were going, wait a minute, we know our kids aren't getting the education that they need. We need to provide for more choice. When I ran for re-election in 12, I had a Democratic opponent who steadfastly opposed the charter school amendment. Interestingly enough, the charter school amendment passed by a wider margin in my Democratic precincts than it did in my Republican precinct.
And this is when the district's been shifted out of Sandy Springs.
Yeah, okay. When it was shifted down out of Sandy Springs, came closer down into Midtown, and into some minority areas that I thought were important. And I was very glad to have those precincts in my district, because I do believe that you need to have a more diverse district. But I found that to be fascinating, and it's parties need to be focused on those gateway issues, and which oftentimes are those issues that really require true governing. Transportation is another gateway issue. The issues that I've been talking about the most are those gateway issues that I want to see my party focus more on in the coming years. And if we do, and if we we'll continue to be in power, and if we don't, we will lose power.
How much credit goes to Governor Deal, Speaker Ralston, for the balancing act of enacting those priorities: education, transit, criminal justice, so on, economic development, pro-growth agenda, and balancing hot button cultural, social issues? Like, the one that always comes to mind is the RFRA, the Religious Freedom Bill, that always turns up somewhere in the legislature at some point.
Leadership is critical. Mm-hmm. Having someone willing to sort of sit down and say, okay, I'm going to take point. I'm going to and that means that I'm going to drive the agenda. I'm going to accept the attacks that take place, and I'm going to be the man in the middle, the man in the arena that Teddy Roosevelt used to like to talk about. Those sort of individuals are critically important to both advance that legislation and those issues that are important to the state, and quite frankly, stand up to your own constituents sometimes in your own party and go, that's not such a good idea. To borrow from the Harry Potter series, I quoted, I named my dog after Dumbledore. Dumbledore, in I believe the first book, sort of talked about, it takes courage to stand up to your enemies. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes, it takes more courage to stand up to your friends. 10
points to Neville Longbottom.
To Neville Longbottom, that's right, and that is perhaps the most difficult thing that oftentimes happens in politics. To look, your biggest supporter and go, I love you. I'll need you in the next election, but on this issue, you're wrong. But if you're not prepared to do that, then you really don't need to be in office, because there are going to be some issues that your biggest supporter simply disagrees with you on. You've got to be respectful enough to sort of sit down and chat with them and sort of tell them why. But in the end, you've got to be prepared to do it. I still remember one issue shortly after I got elected. I voted against a bill that was overwhelmingly supported by a big quarter of my community, but I didn't think it was constitutional, and I had to walk into a room full of people who thought otherwise and sort of explain it. And at the end of the day, I was very grateful that they slapped me on the back, said I was wrong, but I'm still their boy. But you've got to be willing to do that.
What are those issues? We've talked about how this is a period of extreme partisanship, more so at the national level, but it's present in Georgia. What are the issues that Democrats and Republicans, or at least some Democrats and some Republicans, can work on to actually enact through the legislature and have signed by the governor?
Well, Georgia, I still think has the ability to govern in the legislature.
We can't say that for everywhere.
In Congress, sometimes you have to wonder, which is dangerous and
right.
In the long run. But in Georgia, you've had a willingness to sit down and go, okay, these are the education issues that we've got to fix. These are the transportation issues. The transportation bills that we've talked about, for instance, have been largely bipartisan in nature. We would not have passed the charter school amendment without Democratic support. While the Democratic leadership opposed us, we had, 15 or 16 Democrats, some of the most liberal Democrats in the state house, as a matter of fact, crossed over and voted with us. We've, and you saw it obviously with criminal justice reform as well, enormous bipartisanship taking place. So there are a lot of issues that we're seeing bipartisanship. The press often, understandably so, wants to focus on where they're fighting, rather than where they're getting along. Mm-hmm. But you're seeing that in this session. Last week, dropped a hate crime piece of legislation being authored by a Republican. with 3 very strong Democrats on the co-sponsorship list. You're seeing that with Kevin Tanner's bill this year, dealing with transit governance issues.
Mm-hmm.
You're seeing strong bipartisanship there. So, we're still seeing that in Georgia. I hope that maybe my friends up in Washington will start to look at states like Georgia and others and say, okay, maybe we need to see how they're doing it.
More 5-point plans and fewer pitchforks and torches, maybe.
Pitchforks and torches have their place.
Sure.
And have their time. And keep in mind, while my friend, argued for that, I've noticed that when he got up there, after he took his pitchfork and his torch, but he also, showed up willing to work.
Right.
And the interesting thing was, about 2 years later, when he was running for re-election, some people who wanted to run against him came to me and said, well, I want to run against him. Will you support me? And I'm going, well, the fact of the matter is, yes, he showed up with a pitchfork and a torch to make a statement, but when he got up there, he started trying to get things done. And so, I'm sorry, but he's my congressman now.
Well, you've mentioned sort of the inability to govern or factionalism or sort of a complacency, overplaying your hand politically. What role does demographic change play in the future of the Republican Party?
It can if we allow it to, and it's very dangerous if we allow it to on both sides. Nothing infuriates me more than people start discussing political party change based on demographics, because I think it's anti-democratic for this reason. If a demographic group is 100% with one party and not with the other party, here's what happens. The party that they're with tends to take them for granted and doesn't focus on their needs, and the party that they don't go with tends to ignore their problems. They're very legitimate problems. That's bad. That's bad governance, period, and it's just, it's bad for democracy. It is a whole lot better for parties to focus on ways in which to reach all groups. And what I tell my friends in the Republican Party, and I'll tell my friends in the Democratic Party the same thing. You want to be in the majority, govern well. Focus on the issues involved. We've touched on some of those already that may not necessarily be viewed as Republican issues, but are important issues. We've got to, as a Republican Party, be able to apply our conservative principles to fix the problems in Southwest Atlanta, okay? And if we can't, then we need to start rethinking our issues. But I believe that we can. We need to take conservative principle to fix the issue of transit here in Metro Atlanta. That's very important. We need to take those conservative principles and create a 21st century education system that provides opportunity for every child in our state. And if we do, we will govern and we will continue being in power. And if we don't, somebody will replace us, and by God, they should.
You sound like you have a lot of really good ideas. Are you sure that you're done with elective office?
I don't know if I'm cured or if I'm in remission.
Oh, okay. That's a good answer. A very political answer.
I like what I'm doing now at Denton's.
Sure.
I'm the head of its Georgia public policy team. I'm getting to deal with a lot of these issues at the Capitol. My wife and my law partners like my present role. So we'll see where we go from here. And what lies ahead is unknown.
You already mentioned President Trump, his campaign, victory. A few places he wasn't successful or victorious: Cobb County, Gwinnett County, North Fulton County, the 6th district.
My old district.
He ran well behind Mitt Romney.
Yeah.
An establishment, the establishment Republican Mitt Romney. What do you think accounts for that sort of drop off from traditional areas of traditional Republican support?
Well, beyond ideology, beyond party, you can see two different kinds of people in politics. You've got folks who wish to who seek election and seek to govern by the principles of addition and multiplication. And then you have political leaders and candidates who wish to run and govern under the philosophy of subtraction and division. And I think it'd be fair to say that that President Trump chose to run through the politics of division. Now, mind you, I think Secretary Clinton did the same thing. Unfortunately, we had two people, one of these rare situations where we actually had two people running, seeking to do that. And I think that had a lot to do with it. In the long run, I'm one of these people who believes, you keep your opponents temporary and your friends permanent. Other folks in politics feel very differently, and that's just two different philosophies. And I'm not saying Trump and I, for instance, have two different philosophies on how to govern beyond ideology. There are some things that he's done in terms of his administration that I very much agree with. His tax policies, his deregulation policies, I very much agree with. There are other things that I very much disagree with him on, that I feel are unduly divisive, and sometimes just plain morally wrong. I have a son who's a graduate of West Point, and in his class had kids from all over this country, from every religion and every race. I don't know if you've ever been to a service academy graduation, but most people think the most exciting thing is when they toss the hats in the air. That's not the most exciting thing. The most exciting thing comes after the graduation ceremony, in which these same young people put on the uniforms that they're going to be wearing in the armed services and get sworn in tiny little ceremonies all over campus. And I watch kids who were Muslim and Jews and Christians and every other religion and every possible race you can imagine swear to uphold the Constitution and protect my my life. That's the America that I want to see us focus on, and that kind of understanding of unity.
Just to wrap up, we're into an election year. It's 2018 already. You said in the press recently that any successful candidate's going to have to get beyond bumper sticker issues. What did you mean by that?
Well, that meant you got to drill down. You got to look at what are some of the core problems that we face, not just today, but in the next 5 to 10 years. Those bread and butter issues that improve the quality of life for our citizens. And those are the issues basically that we've talked about. How do we create a 21st century education system here in Georgia that works for every child, not just my children who grew up in Buckhead, but for that child in Southwest Atlanta, or that child in Wilcox County, or that child in Bartow, or any place else. How do we do that? We don't have that right now, but we need to be figuring out ways to work toward that. How do we, fix the transportation system that works, not just, deals with the issues in Metro Atlanta, but also deals with the concerns in rural Georgia? How do we deal with those rural issues that we talked about earlier that need to be done in order to make rural Georgia the vibrant place to live that I want to see happen because my family heritage is located there? That's what I'm talking about. Those little bumper sticker issues that'll get a crowd ignited, it's like cotton candy, those bumper sticker issues. They taste real good and then they dissolve quickly.
There's sort of a political sugar high.
You get a temporary sugar high, but in the end they do nothing for you in terms of nutrition. We've got to work toward that, and the candidate that resonates will be the candidate who will be successful.
Well, Mr. Lindsey, it has been an honor and a privilege.
Thank you
for participating in the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project at the Russell Library. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for allowing me to participate.